Welcome to L'Arte dell'Arme, the Bolognese podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with the practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life. This week's guest is Eric Lowe. Eric Lowe began training in HEMA in New York City with the New York Historical Fencing Association. He's been a principal instructor at Swordwind Historical Swordsmanship in Charlotte, North Carolina for 6 years. Eric has medaled in cutting tournaments with both one and two-handed swords, form tournaments, and side sword tournaments in East Coast competitions. He's also the author of The Use of Medieval Weaponry, a survey of medieval HEMA traditions and the weapons they teach. Eric, welcome to the podcast.
It's good to be here.
Hey, it's great to have you. Tell me a little bit about what inspired you to write The Use of Medieval Weaponry.
So the book was kind of a funny story, and it goes back to an offhand comment that I think Mike Edelson made on Facebook years and years ago. The HEMA Facebook kind of presence is actually much larger than the HEMA practitioner presence. So you get a lot of people coming onto HEMA Facebook groups and asking kind of, very earnest beginner questions about how HEMA works and different sources and, all the sorts of things that people kind of weapons nerds wonder about in our spare time.
Yeah.
And it was back in, I guess, 2015 or so, when Mike Edelson and a couple other of the kind of like what I think of as the previous generation of HEMA instructors just said, they were getting kind of burnt out answering the same questions over and over and over again, and wondering when the next generation of fencers was going to step up and start answering these things. And Mike was my grand teacher, the teacher of Tristan Zukowski, who's the guy that I started training under. And that comment just really kind of struck me that, when do we start kind of educating people about historical arts and kind of step up as fencers in our own right who know things and can, educate the public. And that's always been a part of what I wanted Swordwind to be. And we do that at public demonstrations and that sort of thing. But I kind of took that moment as a challenge to pick a part of the internet and, kind of post myself there as the friendly neighborhood HEMA person. So I started writing about HEMA on Quora.com, and a couple of years ago, out of the blue, this UK publisher contacted me and said, "Hey, we've been reading your stuff on Quora, and we think it's really great, and we'd love it if you would write a book for us about that sort of thing." And so I immediately said, "No, I'm not qualified." And a couple of my students talked me down off that ledge and said, "What are you talking about?" They specifically, they specifically came to you because of, the kind of the voice I was writing in, I think, as much as the content. And so I took them up on the offer, and then when I sat down to try and think, okay, so what is a book length kind of, what is HEMA text look like? Ultimately, what I settled on was back in the late 90s when I was in high school, I was trying to do research on, it wasn't called HEMA at the time, but I was writing a role-playing game system, and I was trying to figure out how do weapons and armor actually work. and I thought, you know, we still get those same questions from those same kinds of people, wondering those same kinds of things, and there aren't really any super accessible resources for kind of bringing the HEMA knowledge base outside of the fencing community. You know, we've got the Wichton Hour, and if you are skilled in reading this particular kind of primary source, then you can do that. There are a number of people that have written really good kind of how to interpretive books on particular sources or particular traditions, but those aren't very useful to you unless you're actually, you know, a martial artist. And so my book was trying to take everything we know as HEMA fencers and make it accessible to people who want to know this stuff, but don't want to put in years of practice practicing a martial art just so they can understand the stuff that we already know.
Yeah, so it's actually really funny because after reading the book, I was sitting there and I was thinking to myself, my God, like had somebody written this book 5 years ago when I had started HEMA, I don't know if I would have actually gotten into HEMA. Because here's the thing, Eric, like the whole reason I got into HEMA is because I was trying to write a historical fiction novel. And so I was writing about the Theban hegemony in Epaminondas and Pelopidas. And so I got to this point in the book where Epaminondas ends up getting humbled and essentially demoted down to the ranks because he's sort of subverted by higher government powers, right? And so I was writing this scene where, you know, he's this very experienced military person who has to go back and essentially like reintegrate himself in the basic levels of training of a Theban hoplite. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, you know what? I'm writing this and I have no idea how to use a sword. I have no idea how to use a spear. And I'm like, my God, like I need to learn how to do this. So I was like, okay, well, maybe I should just learn fencing. And then, so I went on a Google search and I looked for, just fencing, regular fencing. And I came across the Triangle Sword Guild and the rest is history. But
I had no idea that's how you got started.
It is, yeah. Had this book existed, I probably would have read the book and I would have been like, this is okay. Well, this is something that I could at least develop a framework off of. But yeah, so
that's so funny. It got started. All I could find was ARMA chapters in other parts of the country, and I just sort of assumed, okay, I guess this doesn't exist where I live. And it turns out that I went to school within striking distance of Puck Curtis, who is, for anybody who doesn't know, a fabulous Destreza maestro. He one of, not in the Bolognese tradition, but one of the best, kind of side sword fencers in a tradition I know. And turns out I was dancing at Stanford with some of his students. And I had just put that historical swordsmanship thing out of my mind as a maybe one day thing. Yeah. And I spent 13 years in the Bay Area not learning from Puck. Meanwhile, I'm doing a classics degree and getting all into hoplite combat. And
nice.
And now we just finished at Swordwind a series on Partisan and Rotella, which is not exactly hoplite, but kind of 16th century Italian people cosplaying hoplite combat, essentially.
That's how it frames out, isn't it?
And so I've kind of like taken this circuitous route past HEMA to for a long time, I thought, okay, one day I'm gonna just kind of buy myself a panoply and kind of try and figure this stuff out. And now here I am in HEMA, doing the closest thing we've got to documented sword, spear and shield, which is crazy. And I didn't know that that's how you got started.
It is, yeah. Yeah. I mean, ancient history has always been my primary passion. Um, and yeah, it's. I also find it really fascinating too. I think Marazzo's dagger would work really well with the Xiphos.
Yes. Yes.
It's
I see you also have had these thoughts.
yeah. I think about this is if every time I read it, I think about fighting with a short Xiphos, and I'm just like, yeah, this works. I'm gonna try this one. So you really do touch on every weapon system. I mean, this is probably one of the most comprehensive books that I've read in terms of just somebody really kind of unloading all the knowledge that they've gained from HEMA. And it is incredibly diverse in the way that you approach it, in that you are talking from the perspective of KDF, the Bolognese tradition, Destreza, Vulgar Destreza, and Fiore. And tell me a little bit about that. I mean, how did you come to have such a broad range of knowledge?
um, so I think like a lot of I think like a lot of American HEMA fencers, I started in KDF.
Mhm.
And as far as I can tell, kind of the modern tradition of what gets taught is basically an accident of history that has to do with what was translated when, and we learn from what our teachers have had access to,
Yeah.
as much as kind of making a conscious choice. But one of the I have to say that maybe so back to that Stanford tradition, back to that Stanford experience. By the time I started HEMA in New York, I had been doing Western Europe and North American social dance for over a decade, which is basically and so like vintage social dance is basically the HEMA of the dance world. We're taking period dances and trying to reconstruct them from period sources with kind of various modern music and dress, but kind of like a period ethos, essentially asking ourselves, okay, once upon a time, cool teenagers did this voluntarily for fun. What was so cool about it?
Yeah.
And so I was kind of used to this idea that if you want to get at a historical physical practice, you need to read widely. There's going to be different opinions from different authors, and you're trying to get at, really kind of just apply the historical method to, something that looks like a particular tradition, but when you zoom in on it, is less of a, is messier than it looks.
Hmm.
And so that was, and KDF, I think, is particularly conducive to that, because the KDF manuscripts we have from the 15th century are just kind of defiantly incomplete.
Yeah.
And they're not trying to be complete. They're, so-and-so's teaching on this particular part of of the fencing art. And people would, was apparently a KDF tradition to kind of collect various masters' writings on different topics into a single, a single book. And so as I was kind of buckling down to teach KDF when I moved down here to Charlotte, I realized that there was a lot being unsaid in the text that I was teaching from. And so I just started kind of trying to read around and see, all right, what other physical practices did this exist contemporaneously with? what other ideas are, kind of in the air. And there's a lot of, if I had started, with a tradition, with a book that was more complete, I don't know that I would have done that. People who really study Joachim Meyer have the benefit of a book that really is kind of like fencing A to Z according to this guy. And Fiorists have, a similar sort of luxury. But in the KDF world, we did not. And so, so I started reading around partially for that reason. And then a couple of years into starting Swordwind, I just informed everybody that we were going to be doing Bolognese, whether they liked it or not. And, and the reason for that was completely selfish. Yeah. All the way back to my very first explorations in HEMA, I kind of fell in love with the side sword just as an object. It just fits my aesthetic preferences for swords. It's not too fancy. It can still lop a man's arm off. There's a certain kind of like elegant length to it. And so when I was kind of dreaming in late high school of the weapons I would want to learn one day, it was the long sword and the side sword. And we didn't do side sword at NIFA. And so once we kind of had Swordwind established, I realized, you know what? I could do that. We could do that. Yeah. I could make people do that.
Yeah. Whatever you want. I mean,
yeah. And so I started looking around at, the various side sword traditions. De Grassi, Giacomo de Grassi was the first side sword author I had ever encountered. So I thought maybe we'll do him. And then I thought maybe we'll do Meyer because he's at least in the KDF tradition and he also does side sword. Yeah. And as I was kind of just looking around at who does what and asking the side swordists I knew, what traditions do you study? What options are there? I came across Bolognese. And I was just taken with the enormous variety of this system. Most other side sword systems teach sword alone, maybe sword and dagger, sword and buckler, and if you're lucky, sword and cloak. And Bolognese does so much more than that, in so many more contexts than that. And I thought, well, if I'm going to make people do side sword, we're going to go to these side sword people. And, so this was completely geographically, linguistically, outside of, what we had been doing, what I had been doing. But that's how we got started in Bolognese. One of my assistant instructors, after doing Bolognese for a little while, kind of fell in love with Volker Destreza. And so he started teaching that, which meant that I was having conversations with him. And Bolognese, particularly because we were essentially doing it, in sort of a self-taught way at first. I mean, obviously we were corresponding with other practitioners around the world, but at the time there was nobody down here in the Piedmont area that was doing really side sword fencing at all, let alone in this particular tradition. That kind of just fed my hunger to read more about, what other fencing is going on in Italy at the time, what other authors touch on this sort of thing. When Pietro Monti's Collectanea came out in a couple of translations, I kind of jumped on that because he's in some ways, kind of standing outside of any of the other fencing traditions we can document.
Yeah,
but
more martial approach.
Yeah, in a lot of other ways, it's almost more valuable to get that kind of third party perspective on weapons and how they're used. And I mean, he writes not so much as an instructor as just a fighting man.
Yeah.
And that I think that, so I just was kind of trying to take in as much as I could, perspective and context wise, and that happened to position me pretty well when Eon Books came calling and said, do
Yeah.
you want to write a book for us?
Yeah. No, I mean, the, I mean, it really sets up a beautiful sort of a landscape of the overall. I mean, I know that you and I have had conversations in the past where we've talked about um, the missing parts of KDF and how
Mm-hmm.
sometimes because of the way that, especially in the Bolognese system, that it approaches wide play in the way that
Yeah.
it does, that it fills in gaps and how the fight is approached and really kind of colors in the Zufecten, where
Mm-hmm.
before, there's a little bit of mystery around that. And it's not necessarily treated as much in the KDF texts. And
Right.
so, like studying both of those, you can have a richer understanding of how that approach to measure is done and then executed. Go ahead.
Yeah. So it's funny. You know, like a lot of American HEMA schools, we were a KDF school, and people were pretty skeptical when I said we're going to do this Bolognese thing. And by the way, they have basically kata. I mean, long kata. And I got a lot of not pushback exactly, but just skepticism about like why would we need to know or practice any of that. I think a lot of, especially American HEMA fencers with prior martial arts experience, a lot of them come from traditions that frankly look a lot more like Bolognese. What I think Bolognese looked like in kind of historical practice, and came to HEMA because it feels more practical and, kind of like straightforward and right to the point. But I agree with you. And I think we found here at Swordwind, really practicing Bolognese makes your KDF less stupid.
Hey,
The I mean, it's a good remedy for some of the kind of well-intentioned, but I think inartful approaches you sometimes see in modern KDF practitioners. I assume this was not true of historical KDF fencers.
yeah,
But oftentimes people, especially people that don't really only focus on the 15th century KDF texts, basically don't fight until they're already in Gioco Stretto, where their manuscripts have a lot to say. We are just about to start actually teaching some of our fencers who have been brought up now like completely in the Bolognese tradition, a little more of KDF theory about like how you work at the half sword, because I do think that those texts have a very useful model for how you select the prese, the prese that you execute. And I wouldn't say that this is, I wouldn't say that I think this is a failure of historical Bolognese fencers, but surviving Bolognese texts, I think, kind of approach the half sword as just kind of a Rolodex of techniques. Here's the first through 26th, like straight A at the half sword, true edge to true edge, and now let's learn false edge to false edge. But there's not a lot said in the text about how do I decide what to pick. When should I execute straight at number 4 as opposed to straight at number 6? Is it just kind of, personal preference? Is it whatever I can remember in the moment? And to some extent, I think the answer is yes.
yeah,
Whatever the technique you can remember at the right time is better than a better technique that you're going to take another 2 seconds to remember. But
Well, to that point though, I think that's one of the things hopefully that I think we're gonna start to see a shift with, because I think with the Anonymous Bolognese in particular, um, he really highlights in some of his longer plays,
mhm,
like this is how you're doing Gioco Larga, this is how you're getting into Gioco Stretta, and this is how you're performing the press. So a lot of
right.
time he actually gives you that full landscape. So you get more of a context of, hey, this is when this press
Mhm.
actually makes sense, rather than just reading, Marazzo's uh, third book of Sword and Small Buckler and applying it to all the weapons like he says that you
Right.
can. And you're just like, okay, well, at what point am I going to throw my sword over this guy's shoulder? You know,
Right. Yeah.
and go from there.
And speaking of which, that's one of the things I've really enjoyed about having you guys in North Carolina, and all of the work that you've done with Marazzo's second assault for for the two-handed sword, um, because I think that also gives it, in a two-handed sword context some of those, here's the entry,
Yeah.
um, and so you can start to infer a little more than just, well, I know 12 techniques and
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I've always kind of been partial to number six.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because that's usually what ends up happening, right? Like, I mean, for me, for a long time, it's funny because I always wanted to work very progressively through Marazzo's two sword stuff, or two,
Mhm.
not two sword, but two-handed sword. Um, and I read, when you read Marazzo, he says that if somebody understands Gioco Larga and they don't understand Gioco Stretta, or at least if they don't
Mhm.
understand the concept of wide play, narrow play, that the person who understands both will chase the wide play fencer across the
Mhm.
cell, right? And
Yeah.
for the longest time, like a lot of my fencing, especially when I fight really good fighters like Marcus Lewis,
Mhm.
has always been just like him chasing me around and me just like parrying him,
Yeah.
because I didn't have that part. I was missing the second assaulti,
Mhm.
and really being able to apply that. But getting into it and really learning to understand it has made me a much more dynamic fencer.
Yeah, that's very true. It's funny. You so Funny you should mention Marazzo, because I've sort of I consciously avoided Marazzo early on in our Bolognese program, um, because I mean I dipped my toe into the water early on,
Mhm.
enough to say nope, I'm not ready for this.
Yeah,
Uh, it felt like, because of the way he writes, and there are those kind of maddening passages where he's speaking to his son, and he says something along the lines of like, I'm not going to explain that because you and I have done it a million times before. And I'm like, but I haven't.
yeah,
But also just the endless forms. I wasn't ready to kind of pull the pull those pearls off the string, as it were, and kind of break them down into what they were. It felt like, it felt at first like reading Marazzo was like reading the Dungeon Master's Guide without ever having read any other books. And
yeah.
like, and I was like, none of this has any context for me. Oh my God.
Well, and this is something that I brought up last week with Steven, when we were talking about some of his preferences in terms of different masters and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I really feel like Manciolino and Delagoke provide a really great foundation to get into the more complex form oriented, or
Mm-hmm.
more passage of play, if you will, uh, oriented texts like the Anonimo and Marazzo.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they give you the individual techniques, and then you can read the Anonimo and you can be like, okay, I've seen that individual technique in Delagoke, and you can pull out two or three different individual techniques and see how they
Right.
fit together in the course of a fight, and that's where you get the flow, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, Delagoke and Manciolino, their virtue is that they teach you how to do the techniques, what to do with your feet and your footwork and everything like that to make sure that you're
Mm-hmm.
changing the line. And then you learn how to flow between those techniques by reading Marazzo and the Anonimo.
Yes, I 100% agree with that. We, um, it's always funny kind of orienting new students to the way we bring people through Bolognese, because we start with Dall'Agocchie, who's pretty clearly the oldest of the big 16th century four.
Yeah.
But I feel like he's so good at kind of explicating the theoretical foundations of the system, and then you can go back to the older, and historically more famous authors that treat all of the wonderful variety that Bolognese has, and then you're ready to understand, because you'll read, the form will say, okay, do this, and Marazzo or the Anonimo, or even, Manciolino in his form stuff won't say what the other person is doing.
Right.
They give you as student like 3 moves to do.
Yeah.
And if we didn't have Dall'Agocchie, the first part of Manciolino for context, I feel like you'd just be waving your sword around.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's more sword dancing versus actually like having that sense of enemy.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really great point. And I think you're absolutely right in that, you have to, that is what makes those basic plays really fantastic, is exactly what your opponent is doing.
And Manciolino even talks about, these assaults are meant to be done with 2 people.
Yeah.
And yet he only gives you 1/2 of the form. And
Right.
So, it's a fun exercise to try and kind of infer what the other person's side should be. But, if you're ever going to learn anything from it, you really need to be able to say, why am I doing this?
Exactly.
And not only what is my opponent giving me as kind of initial stimulus, but, with the second and third moves in the exchange, what's kind of the Bolognese mindset for how my opponent would likely respond to this second move, to this third move, and that's that's what, if we didn't have that, I feel like these books would be, easily 50% less useful than they are.
Yeah, completely agree. So I want to talk about something that's really interesting that I kind of picked up on when I was reading your book.
Yeah, sure.
So you talk about the use of the buckler to protect the hand, and one of your asides, you give this this quoted text where you say, the buckler's ability to protect the sword hand is likely an important answer to the question of why European swords did not develop complex hilts until the Renaissance. Later on, you go to say, fencing with an unaccompanied one-handed sword is a topic to which medieval treatises devote almost no attention, with one important exception: it appears to be a modern invention. By the 16th century, we begin to see references to the fact that bucklers are not always socially or legally acceptable. And what I kind of inferred from that, and something that I think is really interesting, there's a lot of not necessarily debate, but question as to how old the anonymous Bolognese is.
Mm.
And when I read that, I was like, wow, you know what? I wonder if we can use this and place this as a way to say, maybe that's why the anonymous treats the single-handed sword the way that it does, where you get 450 plays with the single-handed sword.
Yeah.
I mean, you still get a lot with the sword and buckler and the sword and targa,
Mm-hmm.
but you have 450 plays because this is somebody who's like, okay, well, this is the way that we used to teach the tradition, where
Mm-hmm.
Manciolino and Marazzo treat sword and buckler as the core foundation of their system.
Right.
And it seems like from the anonymous author, we see the shift where now the single-handed sword is the core of the system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and it's definitely the core of Dall'Agocchie's text as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So people, the Anonimo, I think is really fascinating. Trying to date the Anonimo, I think, is a really fascinating thing, because it's on the other hand, it's also the only Bolognese text that has poleaxe and armor.
Mhm.
And is specifically poleaxe and specifically in armor in what feels like a very kind of 14th and 15th century kind of knightly dueling sort of context. Whereas meanwhile, Marozzo in the 1530s is saying, the ranca, the halberd, and the poleaxe, they're all basically the same. you know, you
If you have Indians, you can do all the same things, just whatever.
yeah, and he's not talking about armor. And meanwhile, Manciolino is talking about, in his introduction, seems to have this idea that armor is something you negotiate. If you're taller than him, and you get to choose the weapons, then he recommends you specifically choose armor from the waist down. And if you're shorter than your opponent, you specifically say armor from the waist up, because this is, what single combat is turning into in the 16th century, this kind of negotiated thing. And so, I know there are some people who are of the opinion that the poleaxe and armor section of the Anonimo kind of drags its date earlier in time, maybe all the way back to the 15th century, when single combat was less of a negotiation and more of kind of a performance of knightly status. And, everybody kind of, you don't have this sort of thing that Marozzo and Manciolino talk about where you get to negotiate the weapons. Instead, we're knights and we rock up in our, with our most badass horses, with our best armor, with our, our most knightly weapons. And this is the way that we do single combat. There's no negotiation, because the whole point of the process is to sort of perform our status as, warrior aristocrats. And on the other hand, there's this, there's the single sword focus, which is fascinating to me. And I think that, and we have people like Dall'Agocchie in the 1570s also talking about the, kind of the tactics of dueling negotiation. And Dall'Agocchie straight up says that it makes you look the most honorable and the most brave and the most confident in your own cause if you choose to fight with an unaccompanied sword in your shirt sleeves. Kind of like the complete opposite of kind of the knightly, or what used to be the knightly ideal of single combat. So, it's my own feeling is that kind of primacy of the unaccompanied sword in what seems to be an unarmored context is in the Anonimo is probably, I find it easier to believe that places the Anonimo closer to Dall'Agocchie than, say, to like Dardi himself. And that perhaps the Anonimo is simply preserving this older kind of knightly poleaxe tradition than to imagine that the knightly poleaxe tradition places the Anonimo very early in time, and that anonymous author is just decades ahead of everyone else in sort of imagining the importance that the unaccompanied, unarmored single sword will have. And I am willing to admit that, by the late 15th century, you have German sources that are definitely talking about unarmored single sword combat with the Langesmesser. Yeah. So it's not like nobody in Europe is doing this. But I can't think of anybody else in Italy that is doing it. And I think it would, I think you also have to grapple with the fact that Marozzo and Manciolino in the 1530s just very much do not treat the unaccompanied sword as kind of the foundation of the system. Yeah. So if there was kind of this, if indeed the Anonimo is predates them, then you have to answer the question of why did they go back to, what sociolegally seems to be the older tradition of sword and buckler as the foundation of their system. And this is all admitting that this is all very conjectural.
Oh yeah.
And we don't have the evidence to know for sure. To me, the Anonimo feels post Marazzo, in its focus on single sword, and I think is just kind of preserving this older, specifically knightly dueling poleaxe tradition, which is a really fascinating artifact. I mean, the Anonymous is doing things with the poleaxe that Marazzo is not. And certainly stuff that Manciolino is not. And you can see the armored context there in a way that the 1530s authors just don't seem to be much more kind of agnostic about.
Yeah.
But I find it much easier to believe that it's preserving an older tradition than that it is kind of prefiguring something that nobody else in Bologna is going to hit upon until the 1570s.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, even Dall'Agocchie, I seriously doubt Dall'Agocchie ever fought with a lance on a horse, but he still
right.
dedicates an entire chapter or a book in his treatise to jousting. And that it's strictly from a sports standpoint. I mean, the one thing about the Anonymous in his poleaxe and armor is that it's very clear that is not playful fencing by any means.
Right. Right.
You're not going to stab somebody in the balls when they're your friend.
Yeah. And it's not like we haven't seen other Bolognese authors preserving earlier traditions as well. The fact that Marazzo and Manciolino have such similar sword and small buckler assaults really suggests to me that these are kind of the ancestral forms that have, they received from their teacher, who received them from their teacher. And I know, you guys have been arguing kind of from the beginning that Marazzo's two-handed sword feels a lot like a longsword tradition that he's kind of expanded to the slightly larger two-handed swords of his day. And the more two-handed sword work we've done here in Charlotte, the more I am convinced by that view.
Yeah.
So, other people seem to be, I get the impression that in the 16th century, the Bolognese fencing of Marazzo and Manciolino and the Anonimo and Dall'Agocchie would have looked very old-fashioned, compared to people, like what people like Agrippa were doing.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And that's actually, I make this argument in the book. That's, I think, why one can justify speaking of 16th century Bolognese as a medieval tradition, notwithstanding the fact that when these people are publishing, the Renaissance in Italy is in full swing.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, sword, not necessarily sword and buckler, but sword and rotella, sword and shield, was actually something that the Lombard League used as one of their sort of primary frameworks to develop their battlefield tactical formations. Let's see if I can pull a source out for that, but I'm vaguely aware of that being something that could be a traditional or sort of systemic thing.
Well, and certainly you see, imperial armies during the Italian wars experimenting with the Rodolero concept.
Yeah. We've got Niccolo Machiavelli's Art of War, right? Which, he essentially says that, I think 1/3 of your entire fighting force should be Rodoleros.
Right.
So they can go and counter pikes.
Right. And open question. I think it's an interesting military history question how successful that ultimately was, but like, but definitely people are doing it.
Sure. Yeah.
And for that matter, I mean, as funny as it is to kind of make fun of Bolognese partisan and Rotella as cosplaying ancient Greeks, which
Sure.
it wasn't not that, but but Marazzo also like does talk in his partisan and Rotella section about using that weapon combination in skirmish.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's and I think the Rodolero concept also. I mean, we see that used as kind of in a skirmish context as well, or in kind of rough terrain that's not very conducive to close order fighting, like in the New World. So it's not hard for me to imagine that Marazzo is being serious about that. That this is an important part of a modern army, maybe not kind of the core of your battle line, but this for foraging, for skirmishing, for kind of what we I guess would call today like kind of light infantry stuff. This is an important weapon set, and which is also one of the things I really enjoy about the Bolognese tradition, that they go all the way from teaching stuff like cloak and dagger, specifically because nobody picks cloak and dagger as their dueling weapon set, and it's something you can kind of spring on your opponent as something they probably don't practice, but you do. All the way to, maybe I want to be a professional soldier because the 16th century is a good time for being a professional soldier, and I want to learn military weapons in a military way. And I love that they kind of go all the way from the duel to not just the battlefield, but parts of the battlefield that modern people tend not to think about all that much when we think about, kind of 16th century warfare. In fact, Palladini, who's a little outside of kind of what I think of as my period, but a Bolognese fencing master, does specifically say, you want to learn this stuff so that when you show up to the mercenary recruiter's booth, you can... Right. Yeah. Okay. That's what you were looking up?
Yeah, I just pulled out Palladini. I was like, man, this is, that's exactly what I was going to get into. Yeah, he literally tells you to know how to use every single style of arm, including pole arms. And like when he's talking about the halberd, he says, just in case somebody ever hands you a halberd and tells you to go protect the doorway, you should know how to use a halberd.
Right.
It's just like, okay, all right, well, that makes practical sense, right?
Yeah.
Because he gives another sort of anecdote, which I thought related really interesting to your section in the book on fighting with two swords. At the end of his two sword section, he talks about how if you're ever in a situation where you're fighting multiple opponents and you need to fight with two swords, he says you should always have your second carry a sword.
Yes.
So they can hand you their sword, and then you can fight with two swords.
The tradition, the translation of Palladini we're both thinking of, came out after I was done with the book, and I was so mad that that I didn't have access to it, because up until Palladini, Palladini is the first two-sword author I can think of who gives any insight into how the heck do you have two swords? Like, are you just walking around with two of these things on your belt? Like, who does that?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And yet, like, it also it dovetails so neatly with Dall'Agocchie's explanation of the Codalunga metaphor. Bolognese authors are using, Codalunga this and that, apparently as early as we have Bolognese authors. And Dall'Occhie explains that, like, this has nothing to do with anatomical tales. The metaphor is, if you see somebody walking around town with a long tail, meaning like an entourage, don't mess with that person because they have many ways to offend you. Like, anybody walking around with an entourage is an important dude, and you don't want to piss them off.
Yeah.
And I read that in Palladini, and I thought, oh my God, like, this is absolutely, I have an entourage, and some page in my entourage is carrying a sword, because they're too young or too ill-trained to use it themselves. And then I can, if stuff kicks off, I can just say, Paige, give me my second sword. And I thought that makes so much more sense.
It's cool though, right? Because
Yeah.
like, I mean, you think about, hey, that actually works in context. Like, you can sort of build out a really interesting story of a historical framework of how those situations could arise. And I think it's great. I mean, it's one of my favorite things about Palladini is he gives that really awesome, just kind of obscure, sort of real world advice that I think works.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, some other kind of adjacent traditions like Esgrima Común have just in spades. Godinho talks about, the sort of practical stuff all the time. And it's great to kind of have that in an Italian context.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It also reminded me of, the this is going to sound silly, but it reminded me of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Who is not that far removed from these authors.
Exactly.
And writing Romeo and Juliet, and he doesn't think anything of the idea that well-to-do aristocrats would get into street brawls.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
And I think, I mean, you pointed it out in the book where you said, we almost need to get rid of this notion that every fight that would have been fought was going to be a fair fight.
Right.
Like, if you could leverage an advantage of more people or whatever it was, then you were going to do that. I mean, especially if you're looking for revenge or something like that, or
Right.
to settle some sort of a debt.
Yeah, and and like we see we see this kind of beginning to be reflected in our certainly we see it in Godinho. We see it, we see kind of an awareness of it in Palladini. I think it's Jacob Monesi in the 1630s who says that another Italian gentleman who's not really a fencer but kind of commenting on fencing, who says that a fencer needs to know how to fight in four contexts. In an actual duel, in when you're just basically kind of showing off with play swords, to demonstrate your knowledge, and also in a hostile fencing saw, when people are not necessarily going to be nice to you, and you need to be able to kind of make your blows tell, in to an audience that is not necessarily going to give you the benefit of the doubt, and in the plaza, when you just might get jumped.
Right.
And I think it's really fascinating that even in the 17th century, which you might otherwise think of as kind of like we're very much into the one-on-one, code duello kind of world. Even then, people are saying, no, this is a thing that happens. Like, the rules may exist, but that doesn't mean that everyone follows them.
Absolutely. So let's turn a little bit away from the book and let's kind of get into you a little bit. I know you were talking about NIFA and how that was sort of the foundation of your fencing, which is the New York Historical Fencing Association, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, tell me about how you really, how you got started with the Bolognese system. Like, I mean, I know we kind of touched on it
Mm-hmm.
already. Where did you get your start, and what were some of the things that inspired you?
Well, the so I, um, the really what this goes back to is John Clements, and that in many ways terrible red book he published on the illustrated use of Renaissance swords.
Yep.
And the I think like a lot of modern HEMA people, there are a lot of negative things I could say about Clements, but I will give him this. If he hadn't written those books, I don't know that I would have made it to HEMA. And I remember, in the late 90s and early 2000s, those books were pretty much almost all I could find. And he was talking about this thing he called the cut and thrust sword, and he just made it sound so incredibly cool. It's kind of it's a little bit longer and a little bit more slender, like a rapier. It's got kind of the beginnings of a complex hilt, but unlike a rapier, you can still cut with it. It's meant for cutting. It can deliver powerful cuts. It doesn't have kind of, the whole kind of confection of steel around your hand like what we might think of as kind of a true rapier has. So there's a certain lightness to it as well. And I was just really captivated by that description because of a young adult fantasy series that I read in 5th grade by a woman named Tamara Pierce. Her Song of the Lioness books changed my life. I named my daughter after the protagonist. And her sword is sounds like the way Clements describes the side sword. It's a little bit more slender than everybody else's swords. It's a little bit lighter. It's a little bit longer. It's wickedly sharp. And I remember in 5th grade thinking that's the kind of sword I would want to have.
Awesome.
Because I've never been, I'm not a small person, but I've never been a large one either. I like my swords a little on the lighter side. And so I read Clements's book, and I thought, he's describing Alana's sword. Oh my God, I didn't know that this was like a real thing. So I promised myself, like, one day, if I ever do this like historical swordsmanship thing, like, I'm gonna learn how to use that kind of sword. And when Swordwind had been established for a couple of years, I kind of one of the things that frankly, I think we're really good at is teaching people how to do HEMA. It's really important to me that my students not just learn kind of the physical skills of the art, but learn how do you pull those skills out of books, so that if somebody wants to do something else, like my assistant Ryan, if he wants to do Godinho, he comes out, like, people come out of my school with those skills.
Yeah.
And so I kind of realized this is what this was something we were pretty good at. And I realized, I could take advantage of that too. I could decide, hey, remember that sword that I've always wanted to learn how to use that we didn't use at NIFA? Hey, I could learn that. And so that was kind of frankly, that was the impetus. I read a book in 5th grade. It changed my life. And I said, I'm going to learn how to use that sword one day. And but we had a couple of false starts, actually, because the first thing anybody learns when they come across Bolognese is Marazzo. He's the big famous Bolognese author, the guy who was quoted 200 years after his death with what was it, something like 17 reprintings of his book. which in a pre-modern world is pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean
Um,
that's the equivalent of being a New York Times bestseller for, the better part of a century.
yeah.
About it.
So obviously I picked up Marazzo and I thought, okay, like clearly this is the man to start with.
Yeah.
And it was a disaster because not only, it was a disaster because not because we were doing forms, but because we were doing forms before we were ready to pull any context out of them.
Gotcha.
I mean, which was something really important to me as somebody who was trained in KDF in the NIFA tradition, that we learned by going through the Zettelglosses in order, because that was the order they were written down in, and we kind of just were willing to take it on faith that there was a reason for that. But it was always important to us that we, were pulling kind of larger system principles out of those plays, not just doing them by rote, even though it was important to us as a matter of tradition to do them by rote.
Yeah.
And so I jumped into Marazzo with that same kind of ethos, and I was like, okay, these are the forms. We're going to do the forms by rote and just trust that there is deep learning to be had here. And there is, I think, and I love Marazzo's forms, and I think they are very deep. But at the time, we were just not ready to pull anything out of them at all. And it was just, we got to the point where people were saying, look, I don't feel like I'm learning a thing. And so fortunately, Dall'Agocchie exists. And we were able to kind of pivot away from Marazzo for a while. But if Dall'Agocchie didn't exist, I don't know that our Bolognese program would have stuck.
So one of the things that when I think about Swordwind as a school, you guys do some of the best triangulation in the way that you train. Um,
Oh, thank you.
have one of the best cutting programs. I mean, all of your students are amazing cutters. They're not just really good at sparring,
Mhm.
or knowledgeable in the text themselves, but they actually know how to use sharp swords. So talk a little bit about how that sort of developed, and like, did that come from NIFA? Is that
Mhm.
something you just kind of really wanted to emphasize on your own? Because I think it's really valuable, and it's something that I think a lot of people could really stand to improve their overall
Mhm.
understanding of texts by exploring.
So, that came from a couple of places. That also, to be perfectly honest, it started with Clements again. Um, and I'm I'm always a little wary of sharing this, because I think there are a lot of I guess kind of very negative things about that man, and I don't want to continue giving him a platform. But but to give credit where it's due, and in some ways I think at odds with his personal practice, what he was writing about in those books, and that was all I knew of him at the time, was just these books exist. He wrote very early on about the importance of doing test cutting in order to learn how to validate interpretations, and kind of, and vice versa, not just wanting to, not just wanting your cutting to inform your technique interpretations, but wanting your technique interpretations to inform your cutting as well.
Mhm.
And that made a lot of sense to me as somebody who was, coming at this from the perspective of, I want to learn how these weapons were actually used. I was, obviously I wanted to know that, if you move a sword in this way, it would actually cut or stab somebody.
Yeah.
um, the and I sort of lucked into, so nowadays there's more than one HEMA school in New York City. But when I moved there in 2013, NIFA was the only game in town, unless you wanted to drive all the way out to Long Island, which I definitely did not. um, not least because I didn't have a car. So, so I mean, I showed up to NIFA not because I've made any sort of kind of considered decision about the way they train or anything, but because they existed and it was that or nothing. But I lucked into a program that was very, very focused on not just test cutting, but understanding what test cutting was. If I think there's one thing that Mike Edelson has, Mike Edelson being the founder of NIFA, if there's one thing I think he has kind of given the HEMA community, it was not the practice of test cutting, but putting test cutting in a better context than it had existed before. Kind of fighting for the idea that tatami is not actually a flesh simulator, any more than ballistic gelatin is. It's a calibrated, fairly consistent test medium. And our goal is not actually to sever the mat, as fun as that is. But our goal is to read the remains of the cut and see what we could do better. In the same way that, like, this analogy doesn't come from me, it comes from Mike and it comes from Tristan. In the same way that, like, if you're into shooting arts, the goal is not to put the arrow into the target or put the bullet through the paper, as fun as that can be. The goal is to look at where your shot was placed to see what could I do better.
Yeah, it's about consistency. I mean,
right. It's about checking yourself, seeing, and it's about what can I do better, not because every single cut you throw is going to be under ideal conditions. I mean,
sure.
Presumably virtually none of the cuts you would throw in a fight would be under ideal conditions.
Yeah,
but
that's really interesting. I'm gonna just kind of
that
for just a second, because one of the things, like, I've done historical archery where shooting with horse bows,
mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I learned early on is the way that you develop accuracy with a bow is not to always hit the center circle.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing that you learn how to do is to group your arrows, because that shows consistency and form.
Right.
And then you learn how to calibrate that to the point where you're putting groups into the center of a target.
Right.
And I kind of feel like it's almost the same with cutting, like when you're talking about making sure you're getting a 45-degree cut,
mm-hmm.
essentially what you're learning how to do is you're saying, okay, are your body mechanics calibrated correctly? Right.
Right.
And then from there, you can start working on the dynamics of adding obscure targets or cutting different types of cuts and stuff like that.
Yeah. And, and so very much, one of the things I really valued about Tristan's teaching that I've tried to continue at Swordwind is this idea that the goal may not be to sever the mat, but the first thing we need to get you doing is not just severing the mat, but severing the mat cleanly. And then we can start making it smaller or learning how to do that from, other positions or with less wind up or, what have you. Because the goal here really isn't to, the end goal is not to cut the target in two. The goal is to understand what makes the weapon tick. What do I need to do to operate this edge? And if I put, to kind of build up an intuitive sense of, if I put different inputs into this, what would it make my edge do? Something we tried to do at NIFA, and I tried to your triangulation point earlier. I tell people that ultimately one of the things you want to take away from your test cutting practice is the ability to call yourself on your own garbage, even in sparring, even in competition, where you may have landed the hit, the judges may have called it, but from the way the sword felt in your hand or from the way your body moved or what have you, that was not a good hit.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that's the level of kind of like, self-knowledge and tool knowledge we want to be building here, not just cutting grass in two.
Right. But I mean, so what I think is something that I think is really fascinating is you gave me some of the best advice that I've ever been given in terms of understanding cutting and body dynamics in cutting with a single-handed sword, because I had shared some videos with you
Mm-hmm.
and asked for your advice, and you gave me some corrections on my overall form and how I was using my hips and my shoulders and the angulation of my cuts, especially as they're coming from the left and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you have a really, really fascinating and unique perspective on cutting with a single-handed sword that I don't think that I've ever heard from anybody else, because you have done so much cutting and you are so good at cutting with a single-handed sword. So tell me a little bit about that, if you could, or just kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
expand a little bit, because I
Well,
think it's really great for people to hear.
so the um, so I started my side sword cutting. But one of the kind of values I took away from NIFA is that actually in an ideal world you would be starting the first sword you buy would be a sharp, and you would learn to cut with that sword, just doing the cuts in your system before you ever worry about application, or technique interpretation, or let alone sparring. In the same way that if you are into, if you want to teach somebody to fight with a gun, the first thing you teach them is how to put the bullet into the target. You don't start with, okay, here's how you assault a hill, or here's how you clear a room or something. And then later on, you're going to teach them how to like target shoot.
Yeah, yeah,
And I guess kind of the reality of HEMA is oftentimes that's not the order we do things. And there are financial reasons for that. There are marketing reasons for that. And I accept that. But I think it's a worthwhile ethos to kind of try and pay heed to. So when I started doing side sword stuff, I thought, okay, well, what do I know about cutting with two-handed swords from NIFA? And let's see what applies. And a lot of it, basically everything applies, which I think is like itself sometimes kind of a struggle to get people to acknowledge that, and it actually ended up helping my two-handed cutting a lot too, because I started trying to cut with my offhand, and I realized that I couldn't. And so I went back to my teachers and I said, why are my cuts so terrible? And they said, you know what? That's probably actually a sign that when you cut with two hands, you're not actually cutting with two hands. You're cutting with your dominant hand, and your offhand is maybe helping a little. But like, if you were genuinely cutting with both hands together, you'd be able to do this, offhanded with just as well as you could with your forehand. And that was a humbling revelation, but I have found it to be true. But but again, kind of the goal was also to, from the beginning, to understand, okay, how does the sword work? And so everything I learned from NIFA about structure and, kind of the way a cut should be thrown and the vectors that go into the sword, all of that I have found to be true with a one-handed sword. But almost more important has been what I think of as kind of the NIFA approach to what test cutting is. Because one of the things I think Bolognese does really explicitly, especially our later authors like Dall'Agocchie, but even the 1530s people, if you pay attention to kind of like what guard you're ending in and that sort of thing, is they have different kinds of cuts. you know, I mean, like, aside from kind of the, yeah, right, aside from the obvious differentiations, like, you know, a full blow versus a half blow, you know, you have kind of implied differences, like I want you to end in a larga guard versus ending in a straighta guard. Sometimes Marazzo gets really colorful and he says, you know, like throw a reverso from his crown to his toes. And,
Yep.
You know, or you have other words that we as Bolognese practitioners can, you know, argue about the meaning of, like, what does it mean when he says to throw a slicing reverso or something like that? You know, but like, I mean, whatever the exact meaning is, clearly there are different kinds of cuts here. And I have found test cutting on tatami deeply valuable in that sense as well. You know, kind of trying to carry through that tradition of the goal is not necessarily to sever the mat. On the other hand, severing the mat shouldn't be hard. You know, there are some people who look at test cutting as kind of artificially difficult. And I was raised to think of it, you know, kind of raised as a fencer, to think of it as artificially easy. That if you can't, you know, mats don't hit back, and if you cannot sever 3 inches of wet grass, then, you know, when it's not trying to defend itself, then your ability to do anything to a resisting large mammal is suspect. Yeah. You know, because people move around, people are not made of grass. You know, like, I mean, they're harder targets than tatami.
Yeah. Layers
and it's so as we've kind of explored more of the cuts in the Bolognese system, like, what does a good half cut actually look like? It's been useful to have both the tradition of kind of, you know, I'm not necessarily trying to sever the mat here. Not every cut is intended to lop off a guy's arm or split his skull in half. But on the other hand, knowing that, like, the mat still is a challenge to you, you know, and if the, you know, my first half cut got, I don't know, maybe an inch into the tatami. And if I hadn't known that this is supposed to be an easy target, I might have been satisfied with that. You know, and I don't think we should be. So it's been helpful as a kind of a challenge as well to say, okay, how deep can I get into this while still throwing a half cut that I think makes sense at, you know, in Bolognese context for what a half cut is supposed to be. And the answer keeps coming back to, you know, what I think of as what I was taught as kind of the fundamentals of cutting, staying grounded, keeping your hands centered, with your hip rotation, the extension, and, you know, I mean, all the stuff that I talk about in cutting seminars, or that sort of thing, all of which I learned in a longsword context, and yet, you know, continually kind of reapplying those to a side sword context just keeps producing better and better cuts. So there we are.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great. I mean, so we could sort of extrapolate then and sort of say, you know, go read Mike Edelson's book, and you will probably have a pretty good framework on how to sort of develop a good cutting foundation, even with a single-handed sword.
Yes, absolutely. You know, and I'm happy to recommend Mike's book,
Yeah,
you know, to people who are interested in improving their side sword cutting mechanics.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things I really like about the side sword is that it's so the title of Mike's book is Cutting with the Medieval Sword. And the side sword is still a medieval sword, even though we think of it as kind of prototypically 16th century. You know, for all I know, cutting with the spadroon is very different. I don't know. I've never tried, but certainly cutting, cutting with a side sword, even in the 16th century, is very much cutting with a medieval sword, using, I maintain a medieval tradition.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's kind of change gears again
Sure.
here just a bit. I want to ask you a little bit about Queen's Gambit. You guys run a fantastic event, and you have annually until COVID in Charlotte called Queen's Gambit. Um, it is, in my opinion, and I'm of course biased because we're neighbors, but it is one of the best Bolognese events in the United States, mostly because there aren't a lot. But I wish like for more people to understand more about it. So tell me a little bit about Queen's Gambit and your framework for making it such an awesome tournament.
Sure. So, so Queen's Gambit came about when there was a period around 2016, 2017, when the Long Point people were looking at creating Long Point South, which was a HEMA tournament at Walt Disney World at the martial arts weekend they run there every year. And there was a year when the Long Point folks got a slot in that. It was televised only on ESPN3, but it was still televised. It was at Walt Disney World with 100 different martial arts events going on, and it felt like a really big deal at the time. And there was talk of maybe possibly making that event the kind of de facto HEMA nationals for the United States. And so as this was, as these kind of heady thoughts were being tossed around, maybe we're going to have a real national competition. Maybe it's going to be on TV. People started asking things like, well, how would we invite folks? And there were a couple of HEMA leagues in existence in the US at the time. And so they sort of seemed like a natural framework for, well, we'll just have the winners of those leagues go to nationals at Disney World, if that ever happens. And it was in that context that Aaron Schober and Ben Strickling and Keith Cotter Riley and I got together, and we said, if this happens, we want the Piedmont to have its own league so we can send people.
Yeah.
So those are the heads of Swordwind, of the Atlanta Historical Fencing Association, of Sword Carolina, and Triangle Sword Guild. And so we started talking about, well, what do we want our league to look like? Because all anybody really had at the time were longsword sparring tournaments. Long Point had a forms tournament, and it had a cutting tournament, but those things were not really standard at the time. Some places had wrestling tournaments, but those weren't really standard either. And so when Ben and Keith and Aaron and I got together and we decided, we started talking about what do we want a Piedmont League to look like? One of the things we decided was really important to us was that if we ever send anybody to nationals, they will be a well-rounded HEMA fencer. We were so not necessarily the person who's best at sparring in a longsword ring, but like we genuinely want to send what we think are like the best overall martial artists in the region, even if other leagues are sending, their best kind of competitive points scorers. And so we decided that we would have an overall ranking that would take into account your sparring ability, but also also your cutting ability, also your forms ability, and also your wrestling ability. And so the Atlanta guys have a really fabulous ring-in program, and so we said, all right, you guys have responsibility for running the league ring-in tournament. And the Sword Carolina guys had some ideas they were really excited to try for a forms tournament in a different format than Long Point was doing. And so we said, all right, you guys have the responsibility for running the forms tournament. And, you know, not to toot our own horn, but we were the best cutting school in the region. And so we got responsibility for running the league cutting tournament. And so, Queen's Gambit started off as a longsword only event that had longsword sparring and longsword cutting, because that was what tournaments looked like at the time, essentially.
Right.
But then we started doing Bolognese, and one of the we've always had a kind of I won't say ambivalent, but the relationship that Swordwind has always had with competition would also, I think, comes out of my NIFA DNA, is that on the one hand, we are training this tradition to train the tradition, not necessarily, and if that includes things that don't have competitions, then so be it. If that includes things you can't do in competition, then so be it. But at the same time, I feel really strongly that the rise of the modern HEMA competitive scene around the 2010 or so just has made HEMA so much better than it was before. Yeah. Not because we're trying to train to win competitions, but because competitions are just a better proving ground for yourself than not having competitions. It's a training modality that I think should exist. And so we were starting to do Bolognese and kind of hoping that other schools in the area would start doing more side sword stuff, which I am pleased to see they all have. And so we thought, well, this is going to suck unless there are competitions for it, in the same way that longsword sucked until there were competitions for it. And so this may not be the end goal, but it's an important service to the community that we're going to need to provide. And so it would have been rude to call you guys up and say, hey, you guys need to run a side sword competition because we think it's important. And so I know. And so we started, Queen's Gambit became kind of progressively more a Bolognese tournament because we felt like it was important that side sword have a tournament to do for the side sword community what the longsword tournaments have done for the longsword community, and the rapier and other weapons as well. So we started asking, all right, well, one of the things I always admired about Long Point was that it was open to longswordists of any tradition or no tradition, but it was always unapologetic about being a KDF tournament that was trying to incentivize KDF fencing, and sort of be a service first and foremost to the KDF longsword community. And so, and I thought that I feel like you get not necessarily better fencing, but a more useful tournament experience out of an event that is that knows what it's trying to be, rather than kind of just being an open box where people come with, trying to come up with a rule set that lets people kind of play in the sandbox. Certainly there are very successful tournaments that have that ethos. I just don't find them particularly useful as a learning experience, and that's, what I wanted Queen's Gambit to be. And so we started asking ourselves, well, what should a Bolognese tournament look like? And part of it, of course, was, well, there's got to be a side sword cutting tournament. As far as I know, we were the first side sword cutting tournament in the U.S., certainly the first on the East Coast. And then we started asking, well, what does Bolognese sparring really look like? And that led us to a couple of things. Our traditional rule set has allowed people to get a kill off of, like to win the match off of a hand hit, as long as it is a good enough hand hit. And there are traditions where I don't think that would be appropriate, where that's not what the way they're trying to teach you to fight. But Bolognese, at least earnest Bolognese, is very unapologetic about, like, you cut that dude's hand off, and then whether that kills him or not, you win.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was something we wanted to keep in our tournament. Something else we've done that we've gotten a fair amount of positive feedback about is that we have neither a single sword tournament nor an accompanied sword tournament. Instead, for anybody who hasn't been, you enter our side sword tournament and you register with a companion weapon, or if you're feeling particularly ballsy, no companion weapon at all. And then for any given match,
that's an option.
That's an option, yeah.
I didn't know that.
Look, I can't make you. So okay, funny story. My first experience actually fighting with a side sword was at IGX in 2014, and I'd had a couple of Messer lessons, but it was mostly something I registered for on a lark. As far as I know, they don't still do it, but I think I've lost you. I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you too. I think it's just the audio cut out.
Okay. So funny story about the no companion weapon option. My first experience actually fighting with a side sword was at IGX in 2014. I don't think they still have a side sword tournament, but they did that year. And I was watching one of my schoolmates fight, and we'd had a couple of Messer lessons, but certainly no side sword stuff, and definitely no sword and buckler. We kind of registered on a lark because we figured we were going to be there at the tournament, and why not? Yeah. And it was the most fun I have had with one hand with my pants on. It made me think, oh my, like, I am definitely doing this weapon one day. But I was watching one of my schoolmates fence sword and buckler, and he was just getting taken apart. And you could tell it was really clear watching from the sidelines. It was because he just didn't know how to maneuver both weapons at the same time. And at one point in the match, he just got really frustrated, put his buckler behind his back, and started fencing one-handed. And and the level of his fencing just went up immensely. Yeah. I remember seeing Travis Mayotte at I forget which long point this was, but he was fencing sword and rapier and dagger. And he didn't really know a whole lot about rapier or dagger at the time, but he had a very strong épée background. And he fought the whole rapier and dagger match with his dagger hand just hanging by his side. And he basically just did what he knew how to do with the sword, and got, did very well for himself. So I decided, yes, I'm going to make you register with a companion weapon, but I can't actually make you use it. And so if you're going to fence the whole match with your buckler behind your back, then you know what, you don't actually have to take the buckler into the ring.
That's really interesting. I mean, I want to keep talking about Queen's Gambit, but at the same time, That's actually a challenge that we found teaching people initially, and maybe this is why the Bolognese tradition uses sword and buckler as a way of like as especially the early parts for
Hmm.
the core of its foundation, is because a lot of people really do struggle with that concept of fighting with both of them together. And
Yeah.
we've always started out our students with a single-handed sword.
Hmm.
You're just using a single-handed sword as your core. Um, and whenever we take people into using companion weapons, it's always a bit of a challenge for them, especially with the buckler. Um, and one of the best, even for me, when I started with sword and buckler, I've done great with sword and buckler, but with sword, when I started with sword and buckler, I was having trouble really connecting the two and kind of
Yeah.
understanding what the strategy was and everything like that. And Chris was like, "Hey, you know what? You're an amazing fencer with single-handed sword." He was like, "Don't even worry about the buckler. Fight like you're fighting with a single-handed sword,
Yeah.
and we'll work on getting that coordination with the buckler built in." And I went into a tournament with that mindset. I think it was actually my first Queen's Gambit, or second Queen's Gambit, maybe.
Hmm.
And I didn't lose with the buckler. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
eventually I started to add the buckler, and I became more and more successful, and I started competing at a much higher level,
Hmm.
as I was actually starting to understand the full system. But at the same time, I mean, it's just really fascinating, and it was the challenge of that, though. It was the challenge of doing that at Queen's Gambit,
Hmm.
um, and having to learn how to adapt and kind of learn how to integrate the two together. That kind of inspired me to become a better sword and buckler fencer.
Well, so to take that back to the tournament,
Yeah,
the at the time there weren't a lot of Bolognese programs in the U.S. Certainly not on the East Coast, where we knew we were going to get most of our attendees. But there were various people who did Messer, who did Saber, who did Sword and Buckler in a KDF tradition, or in I-33. And so part of the reason we allowed companion weapons was because we just wanted enough people to come,
yeah,
you know.
sure,
Um,
sure.
but at the same time, uh, at least by the end of the Bolognese, at least like by the end of the Bolognese tradition, it's pretty clear that sometimes you're going to have to fight with sword alone, and you were expected to know how to do that.
Yeah,
And so one of the kind of Bolognese flavors we added was that for any given match, there's a 2/3 chance that you will fight it with your registered companion weapon. And that might mean asymmetrical companion weapons. Maybe you registered with a cloak or a dagger, and your opponent registered, with a buckler. But the whatever your companion weapon was, you would get it. But there's a 1/3 chance that both of you are going to have to fight with your swords unaccompanied, which isn't necessarily something that Andres Lignitzer cares about your ability to do.
yeah,
Um, not necessarily something that the Kuchner cares about your ability. Well, the Kuchner doesn't necessarily care about your ability to use a companion weapon.
right.
But we felt like as a tournament that's trying to be Bolognese, while welcoming to everyone, this is, a skill set that people should have to demonstrate. And so, we have this kind of mixed companion weapon or not companion weapon tournament, where you need to be kind of equally facile with both modes.
Yeah,
We also added we added our polearm tournament last year,
I was gonna.
or not last year, but 2019.
Yeah,
For the same reason, because it's a part of the Bolognese tradition that was important, and like we were talking earlier, this is not just a dueling tradition and not just a street fighting tradition. This is also I want to be a mercenary when I grow up tradition. and and what if somebody sticks a halberd in your hands and says, Weast, go guard that door?
yeah, exactly.
And like, so obviously in a competitive context where you're fighting people that you don't train with, there are kind of logistical and safety concerns behind, a polearm tournament, especially because, in my opinion, Bolognese polearms are armor agnostic. Certainly, I think they do work in an armored context if you pay careful attention to the way that armored fighting works and kind of overlay that onto the instructions we're given.
Yeah, there's some targeting where it seems like they're definitely targeting somebody in armor.
Exactly. And of course, there's the armored poleaxe, which is quite explicit. But I don't think, but I also think that, the context is not all armored all the time.
Sure.
Like, there's, we wouldn't have so much emphasis on throwing multiple partisans if that was the case. Because in an armored in a fully armored context, a throw is only as useful as it allows you to close. And yet here we have, Bolognese instructions on what if he throws another partisan, and we're basically just either cosplaying Hector and Achilles, or we're in a skirmish context where people, maybe have some armor, but not full armor, and throwing may actually matter. Maybe the numbers are small enough that throwing my partisan to put down somebody on the other side will actually turn the tide of battle, and it's worth it for me to throw away my spear. Whereas, in a set piece battle, when putting down one of the 5,000 people on the other side, that would not make sense.
Yeah.
But if it's, my 10 guys who've happened across your 10 guys, that's 10% casualties right there, and that might actually make the other guys run.
Yeah.
So like there's less armored, possibly completely unarmored context to Bolognese polearms, because we know this is something they did in a duel too, and as we've seen, they make no assumptions about what the equipment is for a duel. I mean, there's just no telling. It could be meat dresses at dawn under the old oak tree for all we know. And so I wanted an unarmored polearm tournament because I thought that's something we don't see very often. It's important to the Bolognese tradition. It's kind of unique to the Bolognese tradition.
Yep. And you even use a few unique Bolognese rules, like Michelino's 2 points for hitting the foot.
Yes, we did. We were trying to think, okay, how are we gonna run this? Particularly because our sword rules are very cut centric. Not so much because Bolognese itself is, but because we are the league cutting tournament, and it felt appropriate that way. But as we all know, you can cut with a partisan, but none of our authors seem to think it's going to do a whole heck of a lot.
Yeah, Marazzo gives one cut with the partisan.
Yeah, and he says, this is not the most, I forget the exact words he uses, but basically this is not the most effective thing you can do with the partisan.
Yeah.
Don't get carried away by the fact that your blade is long.
Yeah, I guess he gives you 2 cuts, right? Because I think you have 1 cut to the leg.
That's true. You're right.
You have 1
and 1 to the arm.
Yeah, or upper, yeah.
But anyway, so we wanted a Bolognese polearm tournament, and we thought, well, why not score it the way Michelino has, kind of drops that tantalizing hint about the foot is worth 2 points. And in fairness, the foot is an important polearm target in a way that it's just less so with the sword. So that felt appropriate. We were really worried the first year we ran it that everyone was going to go out there and kind of murder each other with sticks. But I really have to, and I really have to give our competitors credit. Um, they did an excellent job of managing their force levels while keeping the intensity up. And honestly, one of the things I really like about fencing in the Piedmont is that we don't have anybody in this area that I just don't like competing against, which I have found in other leagues. I hate fighting that guy. He always hits too hard. He always kind of takes it a little bit extra. And we had people being carded for illegal techniques or excessive force or accidentally swinging the partisan, which we were, especially for our inaugural tournament, we just said we're not doing that for safety reasons. And everybody was very good about saying, you know what, you're right, that was my bad. We even had people disqualified for repeated technique violations, and they took it in very good grace and went on to judge very, very objectively. And all that to say, it was a smashing success, and I look forward to doing it at the next Queen's Gambit in 2021.
Okay, all right. So is there any sort of information coming on?
Wait, sorry, I said 2021. I meant 2022.
2022.
Yeah, we are not doing Queen's Gambit this year. Gotcha. It's possible, frankly, that the vaccination situation will end up permitting that. But we would have to make our plans sooner than we know, and we'd rather err on the side of caution.
I totally understand that. It's hard to get the logistics together to get that thing going that quickly. So, what do you anticipate the date range, or is there anywhere where people can find information about Queen's Gambit for the tournament in 2022?
The best place to look is going to be swordwind.org and the Swordwind Historical Swordsmanship Facebook page. The anticipation is early to midsummer 2022. We're talking June, possibly July. But of course, as you know, the Triangle Sword Guild has its Raleigh Open tournament traditionally in August. So we want to try and space that out. So we're not only so we're not stepping on your toes, but so that people don't have to take off too much time in a single span, and they can attend both tournaments, because you guys also run an excellent tournament which also has a bolognese, or at least a side sword component, and I would not miss that for the world either. So
one of the other things I just want to touch on here real quick about Queen's Gambit too is I think it's not really unique, but one of the things that I think is one of the better aspects of the way that you guys run the tournament is you don't just give medals for sparring or cutting. You also give a combined overall sort of biathlon for people who do well in both. And that almost seems like you're encouraging people to be much more well-rounded fencers and really have that dynamic. That's something that I've always really appreciated about the tournament.
I'd like to think it has that effect, because I'll tell you it's cutting that I think tends to lag behind in HEMA schools, or lag behind sparring, certainly. And we were hopeful that by having a cutting tournament in the region, we would kind of be passively promoting that skill, without having to go out and harangue everybody about how they're practicing wrong. And I'll tell you that from the beginning of Queen's Gambit to the last one we ran, the level of cutting competition has risen drastically. So I'd like to think that we are, it is having that effect, kind of encouraging people to explore this part of their practice. The guy who won the longsword cutting tournament in 2019, I think bombed out in the first round of the first time we ran the tournament. And he trained his butt off, and he came back, and he really, and he was cutting against some very strong competitors that year, but it mattered. I've seen people, I've seen people from schools that would only send one, or maybe not even one person to a cutting tournament, show up with like practically their entire competition team shows up, not only for the sparring tournament but for the cutting tournament too, and and give a better and better account of themselves year after year. So I hope it has that effect. It's certainly intended to have that effect. Yeah. It goes back to that initial conversation we had about Long Point South isn't a thing anymore, and there are no United States nationals. But it goes back to that conversation we had about what do we want our league to look like, and we wanted our league to be known for people that are good martial artists in their tradition, not just people who can do the fun hitty part well.
Yeah.
And and so it felt only appropriate in that circumstance to make the highest award at the tournament someone who does the combined best in both. And it's been really fun actually seeing, we've had people win those biathlon competitions for side sword and longsword who did not get first place in either the sparring or the cutting competition. Yeah. And it's great to see. It's great to see those people. In fact, I think one year we actually got somebody who wasn't even in the top 3 in one of the disciplines, but he was like top 5 and did very well in the other, and that worked out to medaling in the biathlon. And that was that's been really great to see, because not just because we're doing it, but because when you're at the award ceremony and and I'm handing out those medals, you can see in the room the respect from all of their fellow fencers. And everyone knows that that person wasn't the best at this or the best at that necessarily, but they are as much, if not more, worthy of respect as somebody who can do, something that's, I think, closer to what we all kind of get into HEMA imagining we want to do, not to speak for anyone else, but I think certainly a lot of my students come to us because they want a sword experience that feels more real than they can get in a modern Olympic fencing context. Which let me pause and say, I am the last person. I actually think modern Olympic fencing is much more real swordsmanship than it gets credit for. And I don't like people kind of poo-pooing that as a mere game. But all the same, I mean, we come with our fantasies, and we come with our, kind of what we imagine, the kind of swordsman we want ourselves to be one day. Yeah. And that I think a lot of people come to HEMA because they want to feel like they have real skill with a sword. And that definitely does include, successfully and artfully hitting people. But it includes knowing how to use the real thing too. And, I'm very pleased with being able to promote that side of things here in the Piedmont. And I'm really pleased to have an actual side sword cutting competition where people can use, people in a side sword or a Bolognese context can get that experience not the experience of competition, but kind of promote the experience and the knowledge of what does it feel like to operate, the weapon that I am training with.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important. All right, Eric. Well, let's go ahead and wrap it up there. Where can people find your book, The Use of Medieval Weaponry?
You can find it on Amazon. You can find it in. You can find it pretty much anywhere books are sold, although they may have to order it for you. You can also find it in the United States at Red Wheel Weiser, who is the U.S. distributor for the book, or internationally at Eon Books, at Eon Books' website.
Awesome. Eric, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'll go ahead and put links in the show notes for everybody.
Yeah, wonderful.
For the Use of Medieval Weaponry, and also for Queen's Gambit and the Swordwind website, so you can go check that out. Eric Lowe, it's been an absolute pleasure, sir. Thank you so much.
Always. Thank you for having me.
Special thanks again to Eric Lowe for coming on and sharing his insights with us. It was a great interview. I hope everyone enjoyed that. Next week's guest is going to be Moreno de Ricci, and we're going to get into talking about fencing in Europe and research. So stay tuned for that and stay saucy, my friends.